No one knows for sure where gunpowder was first invented, but we do know that it was known about in China by the year 1000, where it was used for fireworks and primitive firearms. Gunpowder is made from 3 ingredients: saltpeter, sulphur and charcoal. Charcoal could be made everywhere, but the other 2 ingredients were harder to find. The reason why gunpowder is first found in the East is probably connected with the fact that saltpeter only occurs naturally in China and in Bengal in India, which would later become the saltpeter chest of the world. The 3rd ingredient, sulphur, is found in volcanic areas. It took over 200 years before the knowledge of gunpowder reached Europe. There is no doubt that the invention was brought here from the East, and that saltpeter in the first couple of hundred years travelled west via the caravan routes from China. We are now in Iceland, in the northern part of the island, in the town of Akureyri, where the medieval centre has, for several years, cooperated with the local museum to create an exciting medieval market at Galathea, a site just to the north of here. Galathea was a medieval trading community where the Museum of Akureyri has been conducting exciting archaeological investigations. So far, they have found the remains of trading booths, a church, and what interests us, evidence that sulphur was refined for further sale on the European market. Sulphur was exported from Iceland from the beginning of the 12th century. It was used in the production of wine in southern Europe. The barrels were disinfected with sulphur before the wine was poured in. However, the great demand for sulphur only really began in the 14th century, when Europeans started their own serious production of gunpowder and firearms. The sulphur was sold in different qualities. 1 barrel of unwashed sulphur was equal to 1 barrel of flour, or 30 fish. A barrel of washed sulphur equaled 2 barrels of flour, or 60 fish. And 1 barrel of melted sulphur, the highest quality, equaled 3 barrels of flour, or 90 fish. In 1350, the monk, Francesco Petrarch, wrote about the first cannons that were then appearing on the battlefields of Europe. These instruments, that fire balls of metal followed by enormous bangs and tongues of fire, were very rare a couple of years ago, and looked upon with great wonder and admiration. Now they are just as common as all other kinds of weapons. So fast and ingenious is the human brain to learn even the most difficult form of art. Modern historians have always looked upon the first cannons as not very effective, and having only a very small effect, only useful for scaring enemies with their loud bangs. It is true that the mechanical weapon of war, the trebuchet, were used well into the 15th century before they were replaced by gunpowder weapons. However, modern experiments with early medieval cannons and gunpowder made from recipes from the same period, conducted at the medieval centre in Nykoping, Falster, have shown that these first cannons were highly efficient. It is known today that the Europeans quickly learned how to make use of gunpowder in an efficient way. It is also clear that these early gunpowder recipes are very similar to modern ones. It took some time for these new gunpowder weapons to take their place on the battlefield, probably not because soldiers didn't know how to use this new weapon, but possibly because the medieval gunners had difficulty in ensuring sufficient quantities of the raw materials for gunpowder production, in particular the saltpeter and sulphur. Gunpowder weapons began increasingly to dominate warfare. Medieval craftsmen built highly efficient, large-caliber weapons which had frightening powers of destruction, fueling a demand in Europe for saltpeter and sulphur for gunpowder production. Modern wars could not be fought without it, and he who had gunpowder and cannons, preferably large quantities of both, was sure of success. Greetings, friends from the north, from Iceland, the Faroe Islands, Denmark, Sweden and Finland, and welcome to Borg and our marketplace. Wherever you come from, welcome.
Så velkommen hit!
We are in Lofoten at the Viking Museum of Borch, where we are holding our annual Viking market. The Vikings travelled and traded over the whole North Atlantic area, primarily with Denmark, but also with England and further afield, right down to the south of Europe. The Vikings settled quite early in the Shetland and Orkney Islands in order to have closer connections with the British Isles and Ireland. From there they expanded and settled in Iceland. A lot of goods from both Iceland and the northern part of Norway were taken south to the rest of the European markets.
Og mange gode handelsvarer kom både fra Island og fra Nord-Norge nedover til Europa, til det europeiske markedet.
The reason for this great development in trading was probably the ship. The ship had developed radically from the Iron Age, and the Vikings could at that time sail great distances and transport a lot of goods aboard them. The small settlements of the Viking Age developed and became, in the later medieval period, trading places and large towns. We have one such place here in Lofoten, at a place called Logar, and in Iceland they have one at Galathea.
Vi kjenner slike handelsplasser fra middelalderen både her i Lofoten, et sted som heter Vågar, og også fra Island, et sted som heter Galathea.
I can't think of any better place to start our expedition to Iceland than here at Galathea. This famous spot, with its great spouting plume of water which goes off every 10 to 15 minutes, has given its name to all those geysers around the world. Iceland is really young in geological terms, formed where the two tectonic plates, the African and American plates, are tearing themselves apart at the rate of 2 centimetres a year. Into this ever-widening gap, molten lava and gases regularly erupt. And this is why Iceland has these huge geothermal, high-energy geothermal areas, which bring up minerals, including the sulfur, which we've come here to find. Here we are at the base of the Galathea mountain in Iceland, one of the most important centres for the production of sulphur in medieval times. Here, Icelanders, often using children, just collected the sulphur from the ground and loaded it onto ponies, the rugged Iceland ponies that are so common here, and took it over the mountains to Húsavík and Akureyri on the coast, where it was refined and exported to northern Europe and used to make gunpowder. Behind me is the volcano Krafla, which last erupted in 1984. The light from the eruption could be seen over 300 kilometres away. This very high geothermal energy, characteristic of the whole of Iceland, explains why you can find these huge deposits of sulphur so near to the surface and why they've been exploited since medieval times. We are on our way south now. We're going to Askja, right in the middle of Iceland, where again we're going to look for more sulphur. And from there we hope to go right down to the big glacier, and where there's supposed to be ice caves where you could also collect sulphur from. Hveravellir, sort of in the north of Iceland. Again, one of these geothermal hotspots, right on the edge of one of the glaciers. You can see behind me sort of the steam coming up from the ground, making an enormous amount of noise. Also you can see around sulphur deposits everywhere. Everywhere you look there's yellow. This ground is yellow, everything seems to be yellow, and the smell is really quite overpowering. We're on our way up a breathtaking road to another sulphur deposit at Kverkfjöll, again in the middle of Iceland. It is a stunning road carved out of the rock by the glacier and the river just running hundreds of feet below us. The road is just going up and down and in and out around the mountain. It's totally wonderful. We've just visited Kverkfjöll and we're having to sit inside the car because the wind outside is blowing a hurricane, as you may be able to hear. It is really wonderfully impressive. Very like Hveravellir in the very north of Iceland near Mývatn. Great mounds, great mountains of sulphurous looking earth with steam and smoke rising like a vision out of hell. What's strange though here is that it's very little of the yellow colour you get at Hveravellir. The area is very much an orange yellow. And I think perhaps that the sulphur is mixed with sand, and this is what is giving its colour. We're now in Krafla, right in the south of Iceland. We're in a tiny wooden Icelandic church. It was built in 1838 and is very typical of an Icelandic church. We've now come to the end of the first part of our Galathea project and the end of our project in Iceland collecting sulphur. We've been all over the island, right in the north at Mývatn and then over to the east at Askja and now down in the south around Keflavik and Reykjavik. What we've found very much is a lot of these samples are very different. In the north and the south they've been very pure and there's been very good deposits of sulphur. Some of the places like Askja don't seem to be so pure and nice, good samples as those from here in Krafla. Of course there are other factors involved here too. Places like Askja, which were so remote, probably were never exploited, probably not until modern times when people could get to them. They're just so far into the country. What we found very much with this project, collecting sulphur and looking at deposits, probably one of the first times this has been done in Iceland, is that we've probably posed more questions really than we've had any answers. We've had samples now and we'll take those back to Denmark and have them analysed and have a really good look at them, and perhaps that will give us some clues as to why sulphur was used from Iceland and why eventually it was stopped being used. But probably we'll find in the end that we've got far more questions, and perhaps we'll be back here again in this beautiful, beautiful island. As mentioned earlier on, the sulphur from Iceland was sold in different qualities, either as raw, unprocessed sulphur, washed, or heat treated. Sources tell us of the different methods. To wash sulphur, it was put in large tubs and covered with running water. The sulphur was stirred and the water would remove all the impurities, which ran out of holes drilled at the sides of the tub. The sulphur would then have to be dried, which is a big problem in using this method. The heat treatment method was done by putting the sulphur into large vats a little at a time. It was then gently heated, probably using peat, and fish oil was added. This binds with the impurities which could be skimmed off the surface. The process was repeated many times until the pot was full and the sulphur was poured into barrels. The last method for purifying sulphur is described by the medieval writer Biringuccio and relies on a process like distillation. The sulphur was evaporated in a pot, heated from beneath, from where it was led into another pot where it would condense to a liquid and would then run out into a bucket where it solidified. This method efficiently cleans the sulphur of impurities and makes it very suitable for gunpowder production. The many archaeological finds at Galathea are slowly lifting the veil of the everyday life and work of the Icelandic farmer at the beginning of the 14th century. His efforts meant that in other parts of Europe it was possible to fight wars with weapons of a so far unknown strength and power of destruction. This was in all probability unknown to the Icelandic farmer himself. Nonetheless, his stubborn digging after the yellow gold meant incredible suffering for people thousands of kilometres away. Kings and princes were forced to abdicate, land borders redrawn, and amazing riches changed hands. All this because of the sulphur from the volcanic areas of Iceland. But what about the farmer? Well, he didn't get much for all his trouble. The value of the sulphur would rise by almost 30 times before it reached the arsenals of Europe.